History remembers the ship, but it often forgets the people who stepped away from it carrying a lifetime they never expected. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, as the last lights of RMS Titanic disappeared beneath the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, hundreds of men, women, and children watched from small lifeboats in stunned silence. For decades, the world has returned to that night to ask the same questions. How did the largest passenger liner of its time sink on its maiden voyage? Could the disaster have been prevented? Who was responsible? Those questions have filled books, documentaries, museums, and countless conversations. Yet hidden behind the famous photographs and well-known headlines is another story, one that did not end when the ship vanished beneath the surface. For the survivors, that night was not the conclusion of a tragedy. It was the beginning of a different kind of journey, one measured not in miles across the Atlantic, but in years spent carrying memories that few others could truly understand. Some became famous because they survived. Others spent the rest of their lives trying to disappear into ordinary routines, avoiding interviews, declining invitations, and refusing to revisit the events that had forever changed them. A few spoke openly about what they witnessed, believing they owed it to those who never returned. Many remained silent, not because they had forgotten, but because remembering came with a weight that words could never fully capture. Their stories were rarely simple tales of survival. They were stories of impossible decisions made in moments of uncertainty, of families separated by chance, of strangers whose brief acts of kindness were remembered for generations, and of ordinary people who discovered that surviving a disaster did not always mean escaping it. Long after newspapers stopped printing headlines about Titanic, its survivors continued living with the invisible presence of that cold April night. They married, raised children, built careers, celebrated birthdays, and grew old, yet many carried a private chapter of history that never truly faded. Every anniversary, every question from a curious reporter, every photograph of the great ship was a reminder that their lives had been divided into two parts, before Titanic and after Titanic. Historians often focus on engineering failures, navigation decisions, and official investigations, all of which deserve careful attention. But those records cannot fully explain what survival looked like once the rescue ships had gone home and the crowds had moved on. The official reports recorded names, lifeboat numbers, and testimony. They did not record every sleepless night, every unanswered letter, or every quiet moment when someone wondered why they had been given another chance while so many others had not. More than a century later, new research, preserved letters, family archives, and personal recollections continue to reveal lives far richer and more complicated than the public once imagined. They remind us that history is often remembered through great events, while the people who lived through them slowly fade into the background. Tonight, our investigation is not about how Titanic was lost. It is about what happened to those who lived on after the world believed their story was over. And as we follow their paths beyond that icy horizon, another question quietly emerges: was surviving the sinking really the end of their ordeal, or was it only the moment a different story began? Long before the collision that would define their lives, the people who would eventually climb into lifeboats were simply travelers sharing the same voyage for very different reasons. Some boarded with excitement, believing they were beginning a new chapter in America. Others were returning home after business abroad, while families carrying nearly everything they owned dreamed of opportunities they had only imagined through letters from relatives across the Atlantic. The decks brought together millionaires, school teachers, engineers, musicians, factory workers, children, newlyweds, and immigrants, many of whom would never have crossed paths anywhere else in the world. The ship itself was designed to erase distance, connecting Europe and the United States with remarkable comfort and confidence. To those stepping aboard in Southampton, Cherbourg, or Queenstown, it represented progress. It was a promise that the modern age had conquered the uncertainties that had challenged ocean travel for generations. Among the first-class passengers was Margaret Brown, later remembered for her determination after the disaster, although at the time she was simply returning home after an extended trip through Europe. Nearby traveled Archibald Gracie, a military historian whose curiosity and careful observations would later become one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of the voyage. In second class, schoolteacher Lawrence Beasley looked forward to reaching New York and beginning the next stage of his career. His thoughtful nature would eventually preserve details that official reports alone could never capture. Below them, in third class, families from Ireland, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East shared crowded cabins with optimism rather than complaint. Many had spent years saving enough money to purchase a single ticket. For them, the voyage was not a luxury. It was a bridge between hardship and possibility. Children explored passageways with the excitement only children can feel when every hallway seems like an adventure. Musicians practiced familiar melodies. Crew members moved through routines refined by experience, checking equipment, serving meals, preparing cabins, and reassuring passengers that everything was operating exactly as expected. Conversations filled dining rooms and promenades with discussions about business, family, politics, and plans waiting across the Atlantic. Few people spent much time thinking about danger because nearly every visible detail encouraged confidence instead. Newspapers had celebrated the ship before it even entered service. Modern engineering inspired trust, and trust shaped behavior. Looking back with the knowledge of history, it is tempting to search for signs that something was about to go wrong, but those signs were invisible to almost everyone on board. That ordinary confidence is what makes the personal stories so compelling today. None of these individuals believed they were living through moments that future generations would examine in museums and documentaries. They believed they were simply traveling toward tomorrow. Each suitcase packed in haste, every farewell exchanged on the dock, every photograph taken on deck captured lives moving naturally toward the future, completely unaware that time itself was about to divide into a before and an after. When darkness settled over the North Atlantic on the evening of April 14, conversations continued, children slept, and the engines maintained their steady rhythm beneath the decks. Nothing about those quiet hours suggested that within a remarkably short time, thousands of ordinary lives would become part of one of the most enduring chapters in modern history. The first indication that anything had changed was almost disappointingly ordinary. Several survivors would later describe it not as a violent crash but as a subtle interruption, a gentle vibration beneath their feet, followed by the almost imperceptible sensation that the ship had slowed. Some passengers looked up from card games or conversations. Others paused briefly before returning to what they had been doing. Lawrence Beasley later recalled that the impact seemed so slight he initially questioned whether anything unusual had happened at all. In first class, a few curious passengers stepped onto the promenade deck, noticing only the cold, remarkably calm night stretching in every direction. Above them, the sky was brilliantly clear, filled with stars. The ocean itself appeared almost unnaturally smooth, making it difficult to distinguish where the sea ended and the horizon began. Inside the ship, the routine continued for several minutes. Crew members quietly moved through corridors. Stewards answered questions with measured voices. There was no immediate sense of panic because very few people possessed enough information to understand what had actually occurred. That gap between reality and perception would shape nearly every decision made during the next 2 hours. As officers assessed the damage below the waterline, another reality slowly emerged. The ship had been designed with advanced watertight compartments, a feature that inspired enormous public confidence. Yet the damage extended across multiple sections of the hull, allowing water to move farther than the original design had anticipated. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, carefully reviewed the reports and reached a conclusion that was both technical and devastating. The vessel could not remain afloat indefinitely. While that realization spread quietly among senior officers, most passengers still believed they were experiencing nothing more than an inconvenience. Some returned to their cabins after briefly stepping outside. Others joked about the unexpected interruption, unaware that every passing minute reduced the margin available for an orderly evacuation. When crew members eventually began asking passengers to put on life jackets and make their way toward the boat deck, many hesitated. The ship remained brightly illuminated. The decks felt stable beneath their feet. Warm lounges, comfortable cabins, and familiar surroundings seemed far safer than climbing into small wooden lifeboats suspended above a dark and freezing ocean. For families traveling together, the decision became deeply personal. Parents reassured frightened children while trying to calm themselves. Husbands and wives exchanged uncertain glances, searching each other's faces for confidence that neither truly possessed. Some passengers questioned whether leaving the ship was necessary at all. Others complied simply because they trusted the officers giving instructions. Survivors would later remember these moments with remarkable clarity, not because of dramatic scenes, but because ordinary conversations suddenly carried extraordinary consequences. A choice that appeared minor at the time could determine whether someone remained aboard or entered a lifeboat. Looking back through survivor testimony, one detail appears again and again. Very few people believed they were witnessing the final hours of the voyage. Most assumed rescue would come quickly or that the situation would soon be brought under control. That quiet confidence makes the unfolding events even more revealing, because history was not shaped only by the collision itself. It was shaped by hundreds of human decisions made while certainty had already disappeared, even though almost nobody on deck realized it had. As more lifeboats pulled away from the ship, the distance between survival and uncertainty grew with every stroke of an oar. Those looking back did not immediately witness chaos. Many later described an almost unreal stillness, as though the vast ocean had paused to watch history unfold. From the boats, the great liner remained illuminated against the darkness, its rows of lights reflecting across the calm Atlantic as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. That image would remain fixed in countless memories for the rest of their lives. Some survivors later admitted that, even after leaving the deck, they believed they would soon return once the situation had been brought under control. Others worried they had abandoned family members too soon or wondered whether there was still time for everyone to be rescued. The uncertainty was perhaps the hardest part, because no one in the lifeboats possessed a complete picture of what was happening behind them. Margaret Brown later recalled the emotional strain inside her lifeboat, where fear mixed with disbelief and occasional disagreement over what should happen next. Some argued they should row back toward the ship after reaching a safer distance, believing additional lives might still be saved. Others feared that returning too close could place everyone already aboard the lifeboat in danger if too many desperate passengers attempted to climb aboard. It was not a simple choice between courage and fear. It was a decision made with limited information in darkness, cold, and overwhelming uncertainty. Lawrence Beasley remembered the silence that gradually settled over those drifting across the water. Conversations became quieter. Many passengers simply watched. They searched the familiar outline of the ship for reassurance that rescue vessels would appear before it was too late. Parents held children close, trying to project confidence they no longer felt. Husbands separated from wives wondered whether they would ever meet again. Friends counted empty seats and realized that people they had spoken with only an hour earlier were no longer beside them. Every passing minute transformed ordinary acquaintances into memories. The final moments of the ship left impressions that survivors describe differently throughout their lives, yet one feeling appears repeatedly across their testimony. Time seemed strangely distorted. Minutes felt impossibly long, while the entire sequence of events later seemed to have unfolded with astonishing speed. When the lights finally disappeared into the darkness, many survivors struggled to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The largest passenger liner in the world had simply vanished, leaving only lifeboats scattered across an immense and silent ocean. Yet for those still floating in the darkness, survival itself did not bring immediate relief. Rescue had not yet arrived. Family members remained unaccounted for. Questions far outnumbered answers. Some passengers silently replayed the decisions they had made during the evacuation, wondering whether choosing a different staircase, waiting a few more minutes, or insisting that someone else join them might have changed another person's fate. Those thoughts would become constant companions long after the rescue ships reached them. In later interviews, memoirs, and private letters, many survivors rarely spoke first about the collision itself. Instead, they remembered the long hours that followed, when hope and uncertainty existed together on the same quiet sea. It was there, surrounded by darkness and unanswered questions, that many began to understand they had not simply escaped a maritime disaster. They had crossed an invisible line that would separate the rest of their lives from everything that had come before, even though none of them could yet imagine how deeply that single night would continue to shape the decades ahead. When daylight finally broke across the Atlantic, the silence that had surrounded the lifeboats slowly gave way to another reality. In the distance, the rescue ship Carpathia emerged through the morning light, offering exhausted survivors their first glimpse of safety. One by one, lifeboats approached its side. Crew members extended helping hands, blankets, warm drinks, and quiet words of reassurance. 4. Many passengers, stepping onto the deck, felt unreal. Only hours earlier they had believed they were traveling aboard the most advanced passenger liner in the world. Now they stood surrounded by strangers, carrying little more than the clothes they had worn into the lifeboats. Relief arrived together with confusion. The first question many survivors asked was not about themselves but about missing family members and friends. Lists began to circulate. Names were spoken, repeated, corrected, and crossed out. Every new arrival raised hope that someone believed to be missing might still appear. Every empty space on the passenger lists gradually became harder to ignore. Margaret Brown quickly distinguished herself by helping organize assistance for those with few resources, collecting money and encouraging support for passengers who had lost nearly everything. Her actions demonstrated that survival itself was only the beginning of a new responsibility. Others found themselves unable to speak at all. Lawrence Beasley later described the overwhelming sense of disbelief aboard the rescue ship, where ordinary routines resumed around an event that still seemed impossible to comprehend. Meals were served, medical care was provided, and passengers rested where they could, yet conversations repeatedly returned to the same unanswered questions. How had such a disaster become possible? Who else had survived? Would the world believe what they had witnessed? As Carpathia continued toward New York, news traveled ahead by wireless communication. Newspaper offices rushed to gather information, but facts remained incomplete. Early reports varied dramatically, with some claiming nearly everyone had survived while others suggested catastrophic losses. Families waiting on shore experienced hours of painful uncertainty as conflicting headlines spread from one city to another. When the rescue ship finally reached New York, thousands gathered at the docks despite cold rain, hoping to recognize familiar faces among those arriving. The emotional reunions captured public attention, but they represented only part of the story. Countless families searched the crowd in silence before realizing no reunion would come. Within days, survivors found themselves transformed into unexpected public figures. Reporters requested interviews. Photographers documented every arrival. Questions came rapidly, often before survivors themselves had fully understood what they had experienced. Some answered patiently, believing that telling their story might help explain the unimaginable. Others declined every request, protecting memories that remained too personal to share. It quickly became apparent that no two accounts were completely identical. Each witness had occupied a different place aboard the ship, spoken with different people, and observed different moments. Together, those individual perspectives formed a remarkable historical record, but they also revealed how differently human beings remember the same event. Official investigations in both the United States and the United Kingdom soon began collecting testimony, searching for technical explanations and operational failures. Yet while governments focused on timelines, navigation, and procedures, the survivors quietly faced another challenge that no inquiry could resolve. They had returned to the ordinary world, but nothing about their own lives felt ordinary anymore. They had escaped the ocean, yet the memories of that single night had traveled ashore with them, settling into their daily lives in ways that would become fully visible only as the years passed. As the headlines slowly disappeared from the front pages, another process quietly began. History started deciding whose names it would remember and whose stories would gradually fade into obscurity. The public naturally focused on a handful of recognizable figures, people whose wealth, social standing, or dramatic testimony made them symbols of the disaster. Yet beyond those familiar names were hundreds of survivors whose experiences remained largely confined to family conversations, personal letters, and forgotten local newspapers. Their lives remind us that historical memory is rarely complete. It often preserves the loudest voices while overlooking those who simply returned home and continued living as best they could. In the years that followed, children who had survived grew into adults carrying memories they had only partially understood at the time. Some had been too young to remember the voyage itself, learning about their own survival through stories told by parents and relatives. Others remembered only fragments, a cold night, unfamiliar faces, or the feeling of being lifted into a small boat, with the rest reconstructed years later through family records and official testimony. For immigrant families traveling in third class, survival did not erase the challenges that had inspired them to leave Europe in the first place. Many still faced the difficult task of building new lives in America with limited financial resources, often after losing loved ones or nearly all of their possessions during the voyage. Unlike wealthy passengers who sometimes attracted media attention, these families quietly disappeared into everyday life, becoming factory workers, farmers, shopkeepers, and parents whose extraordinary past remained known only to those closest to them. Crew members who survived faced a different burden. Their profession required them to return to the sea, yet every new voyage carried memories that could not easily be left behind. Some continued working aboard passenger ships for years, while others eventually sought different careers altogether. Their experiences rarely fit neatly into the public narrative of heroes or victims. Instead, they occupied a more complicated space, balancing professional duty with deeply personal memories of a night that had permanently altered their understanding of risk and responsibility. Archibald Gracie devoted considerable effort to documenting what he had witnessed, believing accuracy mattered not only for history but also for the families seeking answers. Lawrence Beasley likewise preserved careful observations that continue to help historians understand both the sequence of events and the human responses that unfolded during those critical hours. Without such first-hand accounts, many details would have disappeared forever. Yet for every survivor who wrote a memoir or gave interviews, countless others left behind only scattered traces, a census record, a marriage certificate, an obituary, or a faded photograph tucked inside a family album. These fragments may seem small on their own, but together they reveal a much larger truth. Survival did not produce one shared experience. It produced hundreds of different lives shaped by the same night in remarkably different ways. Some found purpose in speaking publicly. Others protected their memories through silence. Neither choice was more authentic than the other. Both reflected the deeply personal ways human beings respond to extraordinary events. More than a century later, historians continue uncovering forgotten letters, diaries, and family archives that add new voices to this story. Each discovery reminds us that history is never entirely finished. Sometimes the most meaningful chapters are not hidden because they were intentionally erased, but because they belong to ordinary people who never imagined that future generations would one day search for the quiet details of lives that continued long after the world had stopped watching. For many survivors, the greatest challenge was not rebuilding a career or replacing what had been lost. It was learning how to live in a world that expected life to return to normal when nothing inside them felt the same. In 1912, there was little public understanding of the lasting emotional effects that could follow a traumatic experience. There were no familiar conversations about psychological recovery, few support systems, and almost no language that allowed people to describe what they carried home with them. Instead, many did what their generation had been taught to do. They continued working, raising families, honoring responsibilities, and quietly moving forward. From the outside, their lives often appeared ordinary. Beneath that ordinary routine, however, the memories remained remarkably close. Certain sounds, certain cold evenings, or even the sight of a passenger ship leaving harbor could reopen emotions they believed had long been buried. Some survivors spoke openly whenever historians or journalists sought their recollections, believing that every accurate detail preserved the truth for future generations. Lawrence Beasley remained committed to documenting the events with careful precision, understanding that eyewitness testimony would become increasingly valuable as the years passed. His writing reflected not only what happened but also how easily small details could disappear if they were not recorded while memory remained clear. Others chose a very different path. They rarely discussed the voyage, even with close relatives. Children sometimes grew up knowing only that a parent had survived a famous maritime disaster, without realizing how deeply that experience had shaped everyday decisions throughout the decades that followed. In many families, the story emerged only after old letters, photographs, or diaries were discovered years later. Margaret Brown continued an active public life, dedicating herself to charitable work and civic causes, refusing to let one extraordinary event define every aspect of her identity. Yet even for someone so widely recognized, the voyage remained an inseparable part of her public legacy. No matter how much she accomplished afterward, interviews often returned to the same questions about a single April night. Other survivors found themselves living with a quieter burden. They celebrated weddings, welcomed children into the world, watched grandchildren grow, and witnessed remarkable changes across the 20th century, from automobiles becoming commonplace to aircraft crossing oceans and humans eventually reaching the moon. History moved forward at an astonishing pace, yet one memory continued to travel with them through every decade. As the survivor population gradually became smaller, historians recognized the urgency of preserving their voices. Recorded interviews, written memoirs, and family archives became invaluable historical resources, not because every memory was identical, but because together they revealed the complexity of human experience. No official investigation could fully capture the emotions carried by those who had actually stood on the decks, entered the lifeboats, or waited through the long hours before rescue arrived. Memory itself also evolved over time. Details became sharper in some areas and less certain in others. Historians carefully compared survivor testimony with official records, recognizing that personal recollection and documented evidence each contributed something essential to understanding the past. One preserved facts. The other preserved humanity. Perhaps that is the most remarkable legacy left by those who survived. They did not simply provide information about a historic event. They reminded future generations that history is ultimately experienced one individual life at a time. Behind every statistic stood a person who carried hopes before the voyage, uncertainty during those unforgettable hours, and memories that remained long after the rest of the world had turned the page. As the final eyewitnesses gradually disappeared, a new responsibility quietly passed to historians, archivists, and all who continue asking careful questions, because once the voices themselves fall silent, only the evidence they chose to leave behind can continue telling their story. More than a century has passed, yet the story continues to evolve because history is not preserved in a single document. It survives through thousands of pieces that must be carefully assembled, compared, and questioned. Every survivor's testimony, every handwritten letter, every newspaper article, every official inquiry, and every family photograph contributes another layer to our understanding. None of them tells the complete story on its own. Only when they are examined together does a fuller picture begin to emerge. Historians have long understood that eyewitness testimony is both invaluable and imperfect. Two people can witness the same moment from different locations and remember it differently for the rest of their lives. That does not mean one account is necessarily true and the other false. It reflects the reality of human memory, shaped by perspective, emotion, and the passage of time. This is why researchers compare personal recollections with ship logs, wireless messages, inquiry transcripts, engineering records, weather reports, and archaeological discoveries resting nearly 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. Together, these different forms of evidence strengthen one another while also revealing where uncertainty still remains. Since the wreck was discovered in 1985, underwater exploration has confirmed many details that survivors described decades earlier. The location of debris, the condition of personal belongings, and the physical remains of the vessel have helped historians better understand the sequence of events during the final hours. At the same time, modern research has demonstrated that some long-accepted assumptions deserve closer examination. New technology has allowed engineers, oceanographers, and maritime historians to revisit old questions with fresh evidence rather than relying solely on memory or speculation. Yet even the most advanced scientific tools cannot answer every question that matters. They can explain structural failure, ocean currents, and material fatigue, but they cannot measure what it felt like for a parent to comfort a frightened child while uncertainty surrounded them. They cannot calculate the emotional weight carried by someone who spent decades wondering why chance had allowed one life to continue while another ended. Those answers remain preserved only within the personal voices that survivors chose to leave behind. That is why private letters and family archives have become just as valuable as official records. In recent years, descendants have continued donating diaries, photographs, and correspondence to museums and historical institutions, allowing researchers to reconstruct lives that once seemed almost invisible. Each newly discovered document reminds us that history is never truly finished. It continues to grow whenever forgotten evidence is brought back into the light. Some mysteries become clearer. Others become even more complex. This ongoing investigation also teaches an important lesson about the nature of historical truth. Certainty is rarely built upon a single dramatic discovery. Instead, it emerges gradually through careful comparison, patient research, and the willingness to accept that some questions may never receive complete answers. That approach honors both the evidence and the people behind it. In the end, the greatest legacy left by those who survived is not simply the information they provided. It is the opportunity they gave future generations to examine the past with humility instead of assumption. Their memories remind us that history is more than a collection of dates and official reports. It is a living conversation between evidence, memory, and the questions that each new generation continues to ask, knowing that the closer we come to understanding the past, the more we recognize how much there is still left to discover. The passage of time has transformed that voyage into one of the most recognizable events in modern history, yet history itself has a remarkable way of simplifying stories that were never simple. We remember the ship because it was extraordinary. We remember the disaster because it changed maritime safety forever. But if we stop there, we overlook the people who carried its legacy long after the headlines faded. The true measure of that night cannot be found only in engineering reports, inquiry transcripts, or museum displays. It can also be found in the ordinary lives that continued afterward. It lived in parents who tucked their children into bed while quietly remembering another cold night many years before. It lived in aging survivors who watched new generations cross oceans by airplane, knowing how different the world had become from the one they once believed was unsinkable. It lived in carefully preserved letters, family photographs, and stories shared around dinner tables, often only after decades of silence. Every survivor left behind more than a testimony. They left behind a reminder that history is ultimately experienced by individuals, not by statistics. The official records tell us how many people boarded, how many lifeboats were launched, and how many reached safety. Those numbers are essential, but they cannot describe hope, uncertainty, gratitude, regret, resilience, or the quiet determination to keep moving forward after life changes without warning. Those human experiences exist only because people chose to remember them, write them down, and pass them to those who came after. As the last eyewitnesses gradually disappeared, the responsibility for protecting those memories shifted to historians, archivists, descendants, and ordinary readers willing to look beyond familiar narratives. Every recovered diary, every restored photograph, and every newly discovered letter expands our understanding, reminding us that the past is never completely settled. There will always be another forgotten voice waiting to be heard, another overlooked perspective waiting to be understood, another question that encourages us to examine old evidence with fresh eyes. That is the enduring value of historical investigation. It is not about replacing one certainty with another. It is about approaching the past with patience, humility, and respect for the people who lived through it. More than 100 years later, the ocean has kept many of its secrets, and some questions may never receive complete answers. Yet perhaps the most meaningful lesson requires no mystery to solve. Human lives cannot be measured only by the moment they faced history. They must also be understood by everything that followed. The survivors remind us that resilience is rarely dramatic. More often, it appears in the quiet decision to build another day, another family, another future, even while carrying memories that never fully disappear. Their greatest legacy is not simply that they survived. It is that they continued living, allowing future generations to learn not only how a famous voyage came to an end, but how ordinary people found the strength to begin again. And perhaps that is the story history asks us to remember most carefully, because the greatest chapters are not always written at the moment everything changes. Sometimes they are written in all the years that come after.